So this is Caitlin Snyder. Thanks again for dialing into the April Restoring Neighborhoods Task Force meeting. Also in the room with me is
Ethan Handelman from National Housing Conference. Welcome.
And on the line we've got Rebecca King, who's also with the National Housing Conference, and Steve Pontel from National Community Renaissance. So we've got a really great presentation for you today. And before we get to Steve's presentation, we're going to dive in with a few policy updates and logistical details. So the first thing I want to start with is an appropriations update. Because I'm sure you're all aware, funding for the federal government runs out this month on the 28th. And next week, both chambers of Congress are out for the Easter and Passover recess for 2 weeks. So that leaves only 6 legislative days between now and the deadline. So on the Hill, we've been hearing that President Trump's request for $18 billion in cuts for the remainder of fiscal year 2017 is largely being ignored. We've also been told that really any scenario is in play for this appropriation season, and kind of the options include a shutdown, a short shutdown over the weekend, a short-term CR for a week or so that they can pass a larger bill, a kind of CR omnibus type of package, or a full omnibus, and then the final option is a long-term CR for the remainder of the fiscal year. And as of this morning, it looks like the Senate will take the defense bill that the House has already passed, add the remaining 10 bills, hopefully pass it with no riders, and then bump it back over to the House for them to pass in the final version. There's been some concern that President Trump may veto a spending package that doesn't include funding for his priorities. And there's, mixed reaction to it. Some have dismissed that notion, citing that President Trump's 100th day is coming up very quickly. It'll actually be April 29th, and if you shut down the government on April 28th, that might not look so great. And others have said that Trump and Congress really need a win after the Affordable Care Act and their failure to repeal it. Expecting to see the package unveiled the week of April 24th. That's when they'll be back in session, and that leaves little time for appropriators and legislators to tinker with it, which is kind of by design. And so the last thing I want to say on appropriations is that last week NHC held our annual budget forum. It was mostly on fiscal year 2018, but we also got into just how to talk about these things and how to effectively advocate. We featured a lot of housing advocates from have been successful with connecting with legislators on both sides of the aisle. So we'll send out the slides and the recording in the notes for this meeting.
This is Ethan at NHC. Everything Caitlin said is exactly right. I just want to underscore a couple of points. One is uncertainty. We really have no idea how this is going to play out. There are more scenarios than even she listed. As of yesterday, there are Republicans in the House who are trying to revive repeal of the Affordable Care Act with a new compromise. Who knows what's going to happen? That could consume legislative days. It could suddenly bring more cohesiveness to the coalition of the majority in the House. All sorts of possibilities are possible, as it were. So the other point I want to underscore is what she said about the budget forum. What we've been encouraging housers to do is to communicate frequently and effectively with legislators on both sides of the aisle why it's important to support creation, preservation of housing, the services that go with it, the ways that housing helps to strengthen local economies and neighborhoods, all of the many benefits, and I could go on much longer and I won't, of housing, so that whether it be for the end of the FY 2017 appropriations or the soon-to-be started FY 18 appropriations, they're hearing loud and clear that you can't cut housing, you actually ought to fund it more. There's lots of ways to do that, but the overall concept here is connect with folks on the values that you share with them, and emphasize the solutions that we have to these housing challenges.
Thanks, Ethan. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to walk us through the rest of the policy updates.
Thanks, Caitlin. A couple of themes from Caitlin and Ethan's update on appropriations lead into the next item really well, which is tax reform. So with the, at least for now, failure to repeal Obamacare, Republicans in the Congress are turning to tax reform. And President Trump, ran on this as part of his campaign, lowering rates, closing loopholes. As housers, there's some concern that a major effort on tax reform could negatively impact the low-income housing tax credit, so we're watching it closely. It remains to be seen if congressional Republicans will be able to find consensus within the party to do a comprehensive tax reform package, or if they are going to go for, one could argue, simpler tax cuts. The administration has pushed for a very quick timeline by August recess, but when we're on the Hill, staff don't think that's realistic at all, if it were to be comprehensive especially. But tax reform is another area where there's a lot of possibilities and a lot of uncertainty, but it does look to be an area that might get some attention and momentum going forward. The next update I wanted to share is related to the low-income housing tax credit. The Action Campaign is sponsoring another sign-on letter because Representative Pat Tiberi from Ohio and the Ways and Means Committee ranking member Richard Neal have introduced the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act in the House. So this is companion legislation to the Cantwell bill in the Senate. And it includes, it's very similar to the Senate bill. It includes over 24 provisions to strengthen the credit, including income averaging. It does not include the 50% expansion that's in the Senate bill, but otherwise the bills are incredibly close, and having both the Senate and the House bill is great to actually move this forward, hopefully. The sign-on letter is open through Friday, so we encourage folks to sign on to that, and we'll send out the link in the notes. There's also a sign-on letter for the home program. This was a program that was proposed in President Trump's skinny budget to be eliminated in FY18. So we're really trying to show the importance of the program. And the sign-on letter has been extended, and it's open through Friday, so we encourage folks to sign on to that as well. We are still about 50% below where the program was in 2010. And my last updates relate to some new research that I think is really interesting and relevant for the field. One is on economic mobility. The Economic Innovation Group, took county-level data from its Distressed Communities Index and paired it with Dr. Raj Chetty's research, looking at economic conditions in U.S. counties and comparing that with economic mobility data. So basically what they found is that economic prosperity and economic mobility were meaningfully correlated, especially in rural areas, but that prosperous counties are not synonymous with economic mobility for poor children, which is really interesting. It also found 14.5 million Americans living in areas with distressed economic conditions and low economic mobility. So it really highlights this need for comprehensive community development strategies to help communities overcome these challenges. And the Metropolitan Planning Council and the Urban Institute have also completed some new research on the cost of economic segregation. What they found is really interesting is that higher levels of economic segregation correlate to lower median and per capita income for Blacks, and that higher levels of Black-white segregation are associated with lower levels of college degree attainment for both Blacks and whites, as well as higher homicide rates. So what they found in Chicago is if they could reduce that segregation level to kind of an average level for large metros, Black per capita incomes would increase by 12% and the homicide rate would decrease by 30%. So I bring up this research because for me what it highlights is really the economic value in diverse neighborhoods, that communities on the whole really benefit from being more diverse. So again, we will include all that information, all those links in our notes, and I will turn it back over to Caitlin.
Thanks, Rebecca. So now I just want to let everyone know about some upcoming events that NHC is hosting. So later this month, we're going to have Solutions for Housing Communications. That'll be out in Minneapolis, and that'll be a 2-day session focused on how to overcome local opposition and kind of building off of the budget form and how do you successfully talk about these things when they're not always politically popular or you've got some local folks that might be opposed to development. So I encourage folks to register for that. And then in June, we have 2 events. The gala is on June 8th, and our policy symposium is on June 9th. And at the gala, we're going to be honoring Habitat for Humanity International, Rebuilding Together, Sean Donovan, the former HUD Secretary and OMB Director, and Representative Pat Peaberry for his work on the low-income housing tax credit. So I would encourage you all to register for those. The symposium is free and in the morning, so we're asking folks to come on the Friday, and it'll be lots of fun. And we'll be talking about floods and just general kind of housing policy of where we're going.
Yeah, the theme, thanks Caitlin, the theme, this is Ethan, the theme for the policy symposium, which as you noted is free. The gala is the night before, and it's a fundraiser you got to pay for, but it's really fun and I highly recommend it. The theme for the policy symposium is about new directions in the future of housing policy. We've invited Secretary Carson to provide the keynote, and we'll have 2 panel discussions. One about how local work in all different sorts of housing and community development is bringing bipartisan neighborhood community development focused coalitions together, and the potential for building on that work. And we'll also look at, as Caitlin mentioned, flood insurance reform as possibly the first bipartisan piece of housing legislation to happen in this Congress. The program expires at the end of September. Much needed reform there is much reform needed beyond just reauthorization of it, some of which has direct impact on the affordability of housing, especially in places where folks ultimately settled in flood-prone areas because they had no other options. So we've been hard at work with folks in the Smarter Safer Coalition on flood insurance reform. It's something I think a lot of housers should pay attention to. It also has implications more generally for the possibilities for bipartisan action on housing. So it should be a good discussion, and again, it was a lot of fun. I encourage you all to attend.
Thanks, Ethan. So finally, I just want to go over questions and technical details. We'll be taking questions at the end of Steve's presentation, but you can submit them through the GoToWebinar dialogue as we go on. And if you're having trouble, you can visit support.citrusonline.com. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Steve Pontel to tell us more about the redevelopment of public housing in San Bernardino. And I also just want to mention that he is on NHC's Board of Governors, which is one of many reasons why he's presenting today. So with
Thank you, Caitlin. So, Caitlin, can you hear me all right? Am I connected correctly?
You sound great.
All right. So thank you, everybody. And this is a little bit awkward. Usually I'm used to presenting when I can actually see the reaction of people. So I'm going to try and fly through some comments and then hopefully open it up for some discussion at the end. And I'm also a little bit hesitant because everybody who does the kind of development we do is pretty well versed in, you know, the traditional processes associated with garnering community support. So, but there are some things we've been observing and some challenges that we had to face and overcome that maybe there's some lessons that could be mutually beneficial. And the other thing to keep in mind is this is a California example, and in California we like to make everything harder, more difficult, more complicated, and so some of this may or may not apply to other places around the country. One last piece of information in case you're curious, I'm currently sitting in JFK Airport, so I hope the background noise isn't distracting. So with that, what I wanted to do was start out by kind of characterizing the kind of resistance that we've been observing. And from a broad general perspective, what we've noticed is the opposition is becoming larger and more sophisticated in a variety of ways. And so therefore, in order to become advocates for the kinds of development we do, or actually any kind of development, we need to become smarter and more sophisticated in trying to address some of the concerns. And there are kind of 3 main categories that we've observed that are generating opposition to development within certain neighborhoods. And in a minute, I'm going to get to the actual neighborhood we worked on, but first, some of the general concepts. The first one is fear, and it's fascinating because the fear occurs at both ends of the spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, people that fear the development of affordable housing will lead to the decline of their neighborhood. And on the other end of the spectrum, there are people that fear the development of new housing will lead to the gentrification of their neighborhood. And so when we're dealing with populations and neighborhoods, you might encounter one, the other, or actually both perceptions about what is the impact of development, this project, these kinds of activities on the neighborhoods that we're trying to affect. And kind of piggybacking on some of the comments made earlier about, Raj Chetty's research and some of the other, in general, it's all our goals to see neighborhoods improve and advance for overall population benefit. And so keeping that in mind. The other opposition I'm sure everybody has encountered is quote unquote those people. We don't want those people in our neighborhood. And one of the most important things that we identified is the need to specifically humanize the people that are going to be living in our developments. And in a lot of communities, that means talking about, the level of employee, the level of services that are being provided. One of my standard comments now in California is I certainly wouldn't want to live in coastal California because in the event of a disaster, let's say theoretically we might have an earthquake sometime, most of the first responders are going to be living pretty far east of coastal California. The likelihood of them driving across the region in order to deliver service, whether it's police, fire, nurses, etc., is pretty low. And so for most communities, it's a good idea to make sure you have housing for the people that are working in your community, people that are living in your community, and then if you really want to try and get their attention, their own children, or maybe if they don't want their children nearby, their grandchildren. The third issue is there seems to be very, very broad misinformation around the impacts of development in general. And so you'll hear people talk about, congestion, water supply, other capacity constraints. One of the primary misperceptions is for the vast majority of people that we're developing housing for, these are people that are already in the community. They happen to be living in overcrowded conditions. And so the congestion and the demand for services is already occurring, only it's not occurring by design. So anytime you exceed design capacity, you are putting additional strain on infrastructure. By developing additional housing for the people that are already in the community, you're actually alleviating a lot of the strain on infrastructure. But being able to get to the heart of the fear, being able to get people to understand the people that we're talking about, and being sure that we have the facts about the impacts on the community are pretty critical foundations for engaging in a conversation. And so then therefore, what we talk about as the first steps is that kind of honest assessment of the community. And it's one of the things that a lot of communities have a hard time being honest about, is who's living here, what's the strain. And fortunately, a lot of this is basic math. This is not complicated math. It's really hard conversations, but it's not algebra or calculus. So this is how much people make. This is how much it costs to live. This is what the cost of housing is. Here's the delta. Here's what we need to do to provide housing for either the most vulnerable in our population or those people that cannot afford to live based on the market rate conditions within a community. And so that honest assessment, fact-based, really articulated, maybe with a third-party validator of a university or somebody else to become part of the conversation is very helpful. And then the other main kind of general concept is we've got to get alignment among all the major interest groups in the area, in the neighborhood, in the community about how this is mutually beneficial. So we spend a lot of time getting the health community on board so that we have the president of the local hospital and the other health leaders within the community coming out and advocating for the need for housing. We have the superintendent of the school district and school board members coming out and advocating for additional housing. Because if it's just housers advocating, we're not going to have as much credibility as other interests within the community being able to indicate housing is a critical, foundational, fundamental element of the system of a successful community. Therefore, if you want to have good education outcomes, you have to have adequate housing. If you want to have good health outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. And so getting that alignment among the leaders of other interests is a critical step in especially the most difficult of neighborhoods, being able to articulate the steps. The plans that we look at developing, once again, they need to be very comprehensive and multidisciplinary. So it's not just about the housing, kind of what I said here is a systems thinking type of a plan. Here's how your community works as a system. Here's how the pieces work together. And this is how the plan then needs to be implemented. And along those lines, making sure that it's an implementable and executable plan. So that's kind of a broad framework. And so now I'm going to very quickly, I don't know how many of you are familiar with National Core, but we, have 4 main divisions. We're developers, we're general contractors, we're property managers, and we also deliver social services. We have about 10,000 units in the logical contiguous states of California, Arkansas, Texas, and Florida, with about 400 employees. We have our social services delivered through the Hope Through Housing Foundation, which we either deliver directly or facilitate the delivery, primarily in 3 program areas: child development, family development, and senior wellness. And so that's some background on CORE. Now specifically the Waterman Gardens project. This is a 1943 public housing project in the city of San Bernardino. The county of San Bernardino is the least healthy large county in the nation, and the intersection of Baseline and Waterman, where this project is the least healthy intersection in the county with regard to the per capita number of fast food, liquor stores, vape stores, medicinal marijuana, et cetera, as well as jobs and crime and other statistics. This is a 38-acre site that we took on with 252 units at this time. Our plan, essentially what we said when we first entered into the project, this can't just be a site development plan, this needs to be a neighborhood transformation plan. And we had pretty much universal opposition to redeveloping this plan, especially since we were going from 252 units to 481 units. By the time we were done, we had the first unanimous vote of the San Bernardino City Council in about 20 years. And so we were able to work through all of those elements that I mentioned before in order to accomplish that. The first phase of the project was an off-site phase, Valencia Vista, that I'll show you some pictures of in just a minute. In order to help with the whole relocation process, we're now under construction on-site with the first on-site phase, and we'll be working through the rest of the site as we go forward. One of the main things we also did was rebrand the entire project. It was known as Waterman Gardens, or the Gardens, and the Gardens was known as a very dangerous place historically. And so we rebranded it as Arrowhead Grove, with each phase having their own branding: Valencia Vista, the first one, Olive Meadow, the second one. The tool we used in California in order to be able to really make the case for overall neighborhood transformation is what's known in California is a specific plan. And a specific plan is essentially a land use plan and a development code for a specific geographic area in order to be able to attract new investment by providing certainty for property owners that this is what you can do, and if you're going to do this, we guarantee that you're going to be able to get through the process in a reasonable amount of time in order to attract investment into the neighborhood. The specific plan that we did had a number of elements that we identified: opportunity areas, redevelopment areas, preservation enhancement areas, open space, and being able to bring the community into that process with a very extensive public outreach and engagement process was one of the main ways we were to get ownership into the overall neighborhood transportation, because we were not just talking, once again, about a specific housing development, but the overall redevelopment of an entire neighborhood, and not just the physical spaces, but also the human capacity and human development within the neighborhood. We had a huge emphasis on health and wellness. Within the area, we have St. Bernardine's, which is a Dignity Health Hospital, and in Loma Linda Health Coalition. We had significant other agency support from County Public Health, et cetera, in order to be able to indicate that, look, we can transform the least healthy neighborhood in the country into one of the most healthy neighborhoods in the country through the improvement of the physical space and the introduction of different programs along those lines. One of the things that we piggybacked off is the concept of the Choice Neighborhood Grant, although we don't have a Choice Neighborhood Grant. But in other words, this is about neighborhood revitalization, and this is about creating a place where people would choose to live. So within our housing development, we also not only had various income levels of subsidy, but also market rate housing. mixed into the development concept with an overall goal to make it a place that, once again, the market will begin to move, attract additional investment, and attract people into the neighborhood specifically. And then there's some photos. The units that we developed at Valencia Vista are the nicest apartments in the entire east end of San Bernardino County with regard to the quality of the finishes, the quality of the interior space. And then in the exterior spaces, we introduced a whole variety of additional interactive elements. You know, not only a swimming pool and a play area, but a variety of musical instruments, a series of drums, a series of xylophones, because the local schools have a heavy emphasis in music. So we wanted the kids living in our property to be able to have that kind of musical experience on a daily basis and then have it reinforce what they were doing within their schools. So very kind of interactive play equipment. And then the final couple of slides, we created an amphitheater area for performances, once again in partnership with the school district, and then a community garden opportunity, creating a gardening club on the property. So in summary, probably one of the most difficult neighborhoods to redevelop within the county of San Bernardino, significant community opposition around all three of the areas I mentioned before. There was a lot of fear coming out of the neighborhood. To add a couple of other elements, the city of San Bernardino, 2 years ago there was a study about the worst managed cities in the country, and Detroit was number 2. San Bernardino was number 1. It's a city in bankruptcy. It's a city with a lot of challenges, and so the population in the city is very skittish about broken promises. And so we had to overcome their fear. We had to be able to help articulate the population that was going to be living in the neighborhood. We had to be able to demonstrate how by doing new development, we're actually going to be improving infrastructure to move things forward. And we had to come up with a very comprehensive plan for the entire neighborhood, not just for housing, but for economic development, to show people how when you have a neighborhood where the market's not moving, with this kind of a planning exercise, you can begin to attract investment into the neighborhood and start seeing the market start to move. So with that, let me be quiet and see if everybody was able to hear me okay and if there are any questions.
Yeah, you sounded great, Steve, and you've sparked some questions for me. I know Caitlin's keeping an eye on the webinar to see if folks have questions there. Maybe I'll start with a couple and encourage folks to type in your questions in the question box in the webinar interface so that we'll share them with Steve and get his feedback. I wonder, Steve, if you could talk about, in the context of this particular redevelopment, what sort of kind of non-housing endorsements you brought in to, as you say, bolster the credibility. That, you know, it's one thing for a developer who's going to build something or preserve something to say housing is a great thing and we'll fix this neighborhood. It's a totally different thing for an entity like a hospital or a university or you know, not necessarily a participant in the redevelopment itself to endorse that effort. Did that come into play here or in another deal?
No, absolutely. In this project, we were able to get widespread support from a variety of leaders from different segments of the community. So one example is Loma Linda University, Seventh-day Adventist Medical Hospital, one of the top hospitals, medical university and hospitals in the country. The president is a gentleman by the name of Dick Hart, who happens to be a public health doctor in addition to an MD. And he actually served, when he was a resident, he served kids living in the Waterman Gardens neighborhood, 40 years ago. He, as the current president of Loma Linda, is an example of somebody who came out strong, attended planning commission meetings, attended city council meetings in support of this project, and was able to dramatically demonstrate the connection between health and housing and how, not only having quality housing, but having service-infused housing would have a positive effect on the residents and the neighborhood as a whole. The same thing with the superintendent of schools, Dr. Dale Marsden. He's one of our rock stars. He's now been in San Bernardino City Schools for 5 years. He also came out strong in support of how critical housing is for educational performance and how much this project can be catalytic in this neighborhood. As a matter of fact, adjacent to our project just to the south is currently an elementary school and a continuation school. the school district and is working with us on the creation of a K-12 neighborhood school to also be a catalytic tool of changing that neighborhood. So those are the kinds of partnerships and advocates that we were able to bring to the table.
That's really powerful. I'm observing we have our first webinar question from Sarah Edelman at the Center for American Progress, and she's wondering if you think you'll be able to attract retail or other business investment in the area as part of the redevelopment or as a result of the redevelopment.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. At the actual intersection of Baseline and Waterman, which is the northwest corner of the property, Baseline and Waterman are very high traffic streets. So we brought in CBRE, CB Richard Ellis, the commercial real estate company, as part of our market assessment. And they came up with analysis that the neighborhood could absorb about 30,000 square feet of additional retail space. And so we have begun to work with the city to create a retail component on the corner of the property and to begin to introduce a higher level of food choices. So right now, every fast food restaurant you can even think of is here. So we want to come in with, restaurants like The Hobbit and, Chipotle and others that will just begin to introduce a higher level of food choices within the neighborhood, as well as some other retail choices. So the answer is absolutely. And we see that, once again, that'll start having a ripple effect on the retail store owners around the property. One of the things that we were able to work with the city is directly across the street from us is a donut shop known as Master's Donuts. And if you were to go read the Yelp comments on Master's Donuts, there's something to the effect of, there hasn't been a fresh donut baked in this store in at least a decade. Well, it was the #1 place for drug dealing in the city of San Bernardino. And so us working with the police department, the city, we're able to work finally with the property owner that really just wasn't paying attention to be able to get the current tenant evicted. And so we're 2 months into a 3-month process. They should be gone within a month. And just that one change, other retailers in the neighborhood are now starting to say, okay, maybe this is a neighborhood we'd be willing to make some additional investment.
Well, that is very good to hear. And I will say, drug dealing is awful, but a stale donut is just a crime. So I'm glad you're taking it. Let me pick up on a thread we were talking about just a minute ago. You were talking about the powerful endorsements from other community leaders. If you had to give advice to the folks who are listening as to how to get started building those relationships, what's a good first step they can take?
Sure. Well, let me kind of break it into 3 levels. And so one of the things we did with the resident opposition in the neighborhood was we not only had the community meetings, but then we had one-on-one meetings, including, for example, my wife and I hosted some of the resident opposition for dinners in some of our other apartment communities. And so we have other communities in surrounding cities. And so by bringing them into the community, having them see the kinds of properties that we develop and then how they're managed over time had a dramatic effect on people's perception about, oh, wow, so you can create a quality environment and management does matter. And, so winning over the residents one-on-one, especially the most vocal. We had one gentleman who at the final city council meeting essentially said, I will never support an affordable housing project, but I'm not going to oppose this one. And so, we consider that a raging endorsement. Then with regard to the surrounding property owners, it was really working with them and getting them involved in the development of the entitlements, the uses, the densities, floor area ratios, all of the things. What would you need in order to be willing to make additional investment into your property and to get them on board to become part of a process that says, okay, if this neighborhood's allowed us to do this, this, and this, and the city was very flexible as we developed a specific plan with the entitlement issue. With regard to the other specific interest group within the community, fortunately, the literature is continuing to grow and is mostly overwhelming. So most people know intuitively, and now we can demonstrate to them factually. So sitting down with school board members and the superintendent of schools, showing the connection between quality housing and educational performance, essentially wins them over every time. The public health community knows it because they're interacting with families that are not living in healthy conditions on an ongoing basis. And so really it's what is a win for you and how is what we're doing helping you win? becomes the primary basis of the conversation. And people have a very positive response to that. We're working, with others in this neighborhood. For example, Inland Empire Health Plan is the Medicaid, Medi-Cal provider for almost all of our residents within the development. I mean, they absolutely see how they can save money by supporting this kind of a project. And so being able to work with them and get their support as we, move forward. But really, it's finding everybody's self-interest and getting that aligned with our interest.
So it is great to hear you saying this. Let me highlight a couple themes that come out in other areas where we've had presentations for this task force and others, just because I think they're so important. One is the value, as you describe it, of a truly collaborative and participatory planning process. I mean, a lot of people, myself included, from time to time, when they hear, oh, land use planning process, your eyes sort of glaze over and you're like, this is a useless exercise. It's another, binder for the shelf. But if it's done right, and if it's done as you describe it, getting everyone to buy in because there's benefit for buying in, not necessarily personal economic benefit, but the benefit to what they do and how they live, that can be really powerful, and as your example here demonstrates, can make change. The other theme I draw out is get people out to the sites. This is true for the local partners you're engaging in the planning process. It's also true for members of Congress, which was the theme from our budget forum that was mentioned at the beginning, that often the best way to make the case for affordable housing is let people see it, and let people see it in its best light and when it is done right, and that converts opponents to advocates quite a lot. So I'm glad to hear you doing all of that good stuff, and I encourage other folks to take your example and build on it.
Well, and Ethan, although I'm a city planner, so my eyes don't roll back in my head when I read planning documents. I think it's kind of exciting. So, but the thing we do not do a good job doing, and I think we can absolutely do a better job, is describing, articulating, helping to explain the community as a system. The community is a very interconnected system. And if you're going to have a successful community, you need to know how the entire system works. And there's no society in the history of humanity that has ever survived by not adequately housing its population. And so demonstrating the role of housing within a successful community is something we should be able to do a much, much better job with. And at the end of the day, helping people see themselves in that solution is, I think, what's going to be the key to our success.
I think that's a great point. I'm looking to see, we don't have any additional questions in the webinar right now. I have another one for you, so we can go on a little bit longer. When you were bringing all the financing together for this, were you asking the city itself to contribute significant resources? I remember at the beginning you talked about, their organizational challenges, paralleling those of the major city in my home state of Michigan. And, I know sometimes conversations are easier when you're not asking for money. Other times, if a locality is contributing resources, it means they're a really invested partner and they're committed to the effort. How did that play out in this context?
Yeah, good question. So the city of San Bernardino had no money. I mean, they're in bankruptcy. Even if they had money, they couldn't use it. Huge fight between bondholders and pensions about whatever few nickels they have left at the end of the day. This project was made possible because of the Housing Authority. And so this is actually this particular project went through more complications than, I could probably argue any other public housing redevelopment project in the nation. So the first Valencia Vista component, Jonathan, if you go to the map that shows both sides, that we called it Val 9 during development, was the first off-site RAD new construction project in the nation. And so this was early on in the RAD world. We had to go through and work with HUD and the Housing Authority to navigate it. But it was primarily the Housing Authority providing the voucher support, both with RAD and additional vouchers to make this work. The city did provide their home funds, but the city had actually lost the rights to be able to administer their home funds. So the county of San Bernardino agreed to allocate the city's share of home funds to this project in the city of San Bernardino. It was the only city in the county that they cut that kind of a deal with. And so once again, just the number of hurdles that we had to go through to put the pieces together. And this also all happened before the decline in the value of tax credits. So we were able to get the first two phases done, during the bull, call it a bubble in tax credit. With Wells Fargo as our equity investor, they came in and paid, a really nice price for the tax credits in the first two phases. The third phase that we're trying to get going now is still sitting on a pretty big hole, primarily because of the repricing of tax credits that I think everybody's been experiencing. So we're scrambling in order to figure out, how do we fill a $6 to $8 million hole in the next phase. And in this particular neighborhood, Wells Fargo is our bank. They kind of went out on a limb a little bit coming into this neighborhood, but they did it for us. We're now having to use a lot of begging and crying and pleading and whatever to try and keep, all the equity players in the game now because everybody's being so cautious. So, this project's not done. We're continuing to have to navigate it, but to have a city with no resources, just adds to the level of complexity.
Well, and what you're experiencing on the tax credit front is not unique. It is in part, my sense, is a result of uncertainty around both tax reform and its effect on the low-income housing tax credit and the future of rates, which
exactly.
Gives more leverage to investors, also creates some desire for caution. If you don't know what your tax burden is going to be over the next 10 or 15 years, the choice to make a tax defer, an investment in a tax reduction mechanism is a lot harder to do. But that is something that we hope will be resolved as Congress legislates or not, and investors get a better sense of their future. So I'm hopeful for you. I know that does nothing to ease the pain of the current deal negotiations, but there is some hope.
We hope springs eternal.
That's how affordable housing gets done, I'm told. So
exactly.
I think it's interesting as you're talking about how this came together, the different pieces within it that were not necessarily unique, but pretty dependent on both the timing and the availability of resources. And it's something that I've seen time and again with major redevelopment efforts is you have to weave a lot of sources together. And it highlights the interdependency of the different affordable housing resources that are available. So you talked about rental assistance coming in. You talked about home dollars, which are, capital money that usually a locality has a lot of flexibility to allocate. In this case, there were some other outside considerations. The RAD program, which gives HUD and housing authorities some additional flexibility with how to move rental assistance around and even repurpose sites either on or off existing public housing sites. If any one of those pieces is missing, this whole exercise gets harder to do. Do you find that weaving together of multiple sources is pretty common in these larger redevelopment efforts?
Yeah, it's totally common, and it's kind of a triple-edged sword. So number one, we absolutely have to play the cards we're dealt. The funding, though, is increasingly narrow in its focus. So, for example, we're doing a project in San Diego right now for chronically homeless veterans with AIDS. And so when you have funding tied to narrower and narrower population groups, trying to aggregate them into a master plan community is challenging from a management standpoint and also from a neighborhood partner standpoint. And so, that's one of the challenges within the neighborhood is you start describing the population that's going to be living in the community, the higher level of acuity that people are struggling with, especially when you start getting up into, larger and larger numbers of people with special needs, the community's reaction to that can get stronger and stronger. And so the challenge we have is, how do we knit together funding that is narrower and narrower in its focus, and the potential community reaction to it gets higher and higher. But as we go forward, we're seeing that as increasingly the norm that we're going to have to figure out how to navigate.
Well, I think that's right, and you highlight the pretty powerful challenges there, that sometimes the narrowly targeted resources are a way to either build support in a political sphere to, get enough votes to pass a funding measure or a change in policy, but they can present real operational challenges when you try and turn them into sticks and bricks that get people out from under bridges.
Yeah,
So
no, exactly.
Go ahead, Steve.
No, I was going to say exactly. I mean, that is going to be very interesting for all of us over the upcoming years. So we'll see how it plays out.
I have just one other quick question. I'm not seeing any other in the webinar, so I'm gonna ask that, and then we will close out in just a minute. I will say, when I saw the pool in the drawing in the picture, I was a little surprised, just because it's often challenging under a variety of limitations to have what in California is a pretty standard amenity for rental housing in a subsidized housing property. How do you guys manage that?
Well, for the first phase of Valencia Vista, we knew we had to make a statement to the community that the kind of housing we were building is something the neighborhood would want more of for our subsequent phases to be successful. And so, during the summer, it can get over 100 degrees, 110 degrees in this community. We wanted to make sure that our residents had the benefit and the community saw the investment that we were making. More difficult than the pool, though, were the drums and the xylophones and the other musical instruments, because the pool is pretty standard. And so we actually paid ourselves for the additional educational amenities on the property, as opposed to building it into the application for tax credit and other funding sources. So the pool wasn't as hard as some of the more educational amenities. And one of the things that I'm driving for, and I would welcome others' input into this if anybody would like to talk about it offline, is we would like to start infusing more and more educational experiences into our properties, so when the kids come home, they're surrounded by educational stimulation as they would be in school or any other place. And in theory, there's no additional cost to put math squares and color schemes and other things on the property. And so why not create an environment that can be a learning space in addition to a health space, in addition to housing? And so as we go forward, we're going to be striving to really amenitize the properties in ways that have a double bottom line, and with a heavy emphasis on education.
I would love to learn more about that, and maybe we should talk offline, and if others who are listening to the webinar, who are listening to it later, are interested, drop me an email. It's Ethan here at NHC, and we'll see if we can do that, because I think it connects to other work we've done, especially around trying to get more opportunities for broadband access at home in subsidized housing.
Sure.
Because educational benefits being a major one, there are others to broadband access, but I think potentially there's some useful synergy among these.
Sounds good.
Let me stop here, because this has been a great hour. For me, this has been a treat. I hope it has been for others. Steve, you guys are doing amazing work, and I'm really glad you could share it with us and with the task force today. So thank you, and thank you to Jonathan for keeping the slides moving and all the logistics functioning for this, and to Rebecca and Caitlin for putting it all together.
Absolutely. Thank you all, and we'll look forward to seeing you in June.
Excellent. Thanks very much. And thank you all for tuning in.